Do you want to know one thing that can make a world of a difference in your conversion and your delivery? Do you want to know the one thing that can almost ensure that you capture not only their attention, but also their trust, their belief, and their confidence in you? That's what we're going to talk about in this video. Welcome back to Sales Remastered. My name is Daniel Nicart. I'm the host. And on this channel, I teach salespeople certain word hacks, word tracking, mindset hacks that help you reach the top level that much faster. So if that fits you and that's what you're looking for, you've come to the right place. All right, so there's one thing that I think a lot of salespeople neglect, or they just simply have not been trained or conditioned to understand the importance of. And that one thing is leverage. So leverage allows you to take advantage of the facts that we are able to extract within our first engagement, within the initial conversation, no matter what you sell, right? The leverage is something that serves a purpose. It fills the void, it fills the need that our prospects are looking for. And it does something beyond that. So, it's a difference between saying, hey, I can lower your payment and save you $100 to actually inputting leverage, meaning there's a ripple effect of that. But you wouldn't understand the ripple effect and how it's applicable to your prospect unless you understand these few things that actually enable you to capture the leverage. So instead of saying I could save you $100 and lower your payment, you'd be able to sound more like, and this would enable you to create $100 in extra cash flow so that you can provide for your family. You had mentioned that you're helping your auntie or your mom or your grandma, whatever the situation is, with her monthly prescription. You had mentioned that you had lost overtime, and this is going to help offset your decrease in income and also prepare for the months and potentially years ahead as we step into a recession where you're already seeing the result of inflation causing the cost of living to increase. Do you see the difference in that? I was able to create one statement and actually create a ripple effect of how it actually affects everything within their life. And so oftentimes though, what most salespeople do is they fail to dig a little bit deeper. But I promise you that if you just take these tips that I'm going to outline for you in every engagement and every encounter, not only will you be doing justice to the person you're serving, which is the prospect, but you're going to sound different. Not only that, but you're also going to make them want it more. Can you imagine, if they want it more, how much easier would your job be? How much more money would you make because of more sales that you'd be able to generate? And so there are a few points that I want to bring up in this video. Each and every single point has a purpose. So the first one that I want to talk about is me being in the finance industry, as a loan originator, I have to kind of get a whole picture. And so one of the questions that I see a lot of other agents miss completely is asking if they have any dependents. And not only that, but what are the ages of those dependents? And you might be very well thinking, well, dependents are just kids. Well, it's not just kids, because we have to understand that my culture, I'm Filipino, and you might agree because your culture is probably the same. Oftentimes, our clients are actually taking care of their parents. And so their parents now live with them. Or even if they don't, they provide some sort of financial support to maybe their parents or maybe even siblings. Whatever it is, we have to account for these things because let's just say if it were kids and we were to understand that their ages were, let's say 3 and 5. And then you consider also the fact that, they've owned the house for 3 years. Right? Technically, this house is all those kids know. Not only that, but if in the event you find out that both of them are working, doesn't that create more leverage for you? Because they have to be paying some sort of daycare costs or some sort of fee to watch their kids, whether it's maybe an after school sports or some sort of program, or maybe even a babysitter. Someone is getting paid to watch the children. But oftentimes what you'll find out is that one of the couple is a homemaker. And again, that creates leverage because now you know that there's only one source of income. And so it's very, very important to understand that if your prospect has dependents, and you need to be very specific. So, do you have any dependents? They're immediately going to think if they have kids, right? If they do, say, okay, how many? and they tell you 3, and say, okay, what are their ages, right? This is very important because at certain ages, there are certain costs that are associated with it. So if you have like a 15-year-old, at some point, that 15-year-old kid is gonna be driving pretty soon. Parents are understanding this. You don't even have to be a parent, like just understand that that's just part of living. And if in the event that the kids were, let's say 2, 3, or 5 years old, those kids are essentially gonna be going to school, thus there comes more commutes. And with gas prices nowadays, you have to really kind of put 2 and 2 together, right? Now, let's say if they're between the ages of 5 to 16, there could very well be sports that these kids are a part of. And that is a cost. Cost is always associated with, things that children want to partake in, whether it's sports, activities, leagues. Not only that, but also the commute and the enrollment fees and the equipment fees. You'd be amazed how expensive these things are. But if, let's say, my own personal opinion, my wife is a homemaker, and my kids are in sports, right? So I got a son who plays football, he plays lacrosse, and this equipment costs a lot of money. Not only that, but my daughter does like ballet, she does gymnastics. And so my wife literally is an Uber driver. She's like a full-time Uber driver driving my kids around, which thus creates an expense, not only for the activity, but also for the fuel of that commute. So there are things to take in mind, because dependence in itself is something that you could truly leverage to reinforce the importance of your service. Now, the next one, man, this makes a huge difference. Again, I work in finance, so depending on what you sell, you may not even need to cover this, but if you do, like I am, you want to go over what's called a residual income. And so residual income is basically, in my profession, we go through credit reports, right? But there are a lot of things that you don't see on a credit report. On a credit report, you just see like their cars, the mortgage, the credit cards, maybe student loans, installment loans, things like that. But what you don't see is the cost of utilities. You don't see the cost of groceries. You don't see cost of entertainment, dining out, right? Or kids' hobbies or daycare. And it's important to understand what those costs are, but there's an easier way to going about it versus asking them line by line, how much a month do you spend in groceries? How much a month do you spend in, dining out, right? So you don't need to go to that degree, but there's an easier way to figure out the residual income. Now, for those of you who have been watching my content for a long time, I refer to this as their net. But essentially, whatever you want to call it, at the end of the day, the primary focus and the reason for asking that particular question is because you're trying to identify how much money they're left with at the end of each month from their net take-home income after they pay all of their bills and their expenses. And so it sounds something like this. Hey, John, so you know what? Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, or FHA, VA, they're really focused on what's called residual income. And what that is, John, is, you have your net income that you bring home for the month. And after all your bills are paid, not only everything we see on the credit report, but I'm talking about like groceries, utilities, medical expenses, fuel, cost of living, entertainment, dining out. Like, how much of that income do you have left at the end of each month to put into your checking and savings? Now, it's very important you say that, right? Because we're really going to focus on your checking and savings. Our focus isn't necessarily on stocks, investments, and assets right now, because that's very limited, far few in between. And there is a way to handle those who do have a surplus and they are putting in investments, and I'll talk about that in another video. But right now, what we're looking for is how much do they have left to put towards checking and savings? In other words, like, is there a surplus? And if so, how much is it? Here's the fun fact, is that they're always going to give you an exaggerated number when you first ask them that. And here's the way that you're actually able to extract the truth. And so oftentimes when I ask that question, the prospect may very well say,
I got about $1,000, $2,000 left.
This is how you come back at them, right? Again, you want to dig deeper and say, okay, so if your residual income is $1,000 to $2,000 extra per month that you could put towards checking and savings, can I ask you, with your balance in checking and savings as of right now, are you noticing it that the balance stayed the same, or is it decreasing, or is it increasing? And the reason why you're doing that is because what most will say is that it's staying about the same. And now you have leverage, right? Because if it's staying the same, isn't it fair to say, John, if your account balance is staying the same, technically what comes in goes out. So the residual income would be zero. Is that right? That's correct, yeah. Okay, so that's why we're focused on residual income. So if your account is staying the same, or the balance is staying the same on average per month, What would you say that balance is? Just roughly, rough estimate, John. Your average balance of checking and savings is how much? And then they're going to tell you about $500 or $1,000. Very rarely do you have someone that says anything north of $2,000. Again, this is more leverage, because if I know how many dependents that they have, if I know that you're over leveraging their credit card debt, then I know for certain that they don't have enough money as a safety net if in the event an emergency were to occur. If in the event the water heater went out, or they needed a new fridge, or they had a leak in the house and they needed repairs, right? These are factual things that people have to account for. Usually their only alternative is to finance it. And so, if the water heater went out, they got to open up a credit card with Lowe's to buy a new water heater. Or if there is a plumbing issue in the house, they got to finance it on the credit card just to pay the plumber, the contractor. And these are very expensive. And so we have to account for these things, because again, if John was at a break even, so what comes in goes out, and he was to add to his debt, wouldn't that mean that they're in a deficit? And so you're communicating that, right? So you're telling me, John, if in the event that there was something, an emergency were to occur, like a repair on your car or a repair on your house, or you needed to get a new washer and dryer or something, whatever it is, your only alternative is to finance it. Is that correct? And they would say,
well, yeah, I guess.
You say, well, the reason why I bring that up is because if you finance it, wouldn't that then put you at a deficit? Meaning that it's no longer what goes in goes out, but you're actually putting more out than what comes in?
Well, yeah, if you look at it that way.
Well, the reason why that might be a concern is because there's only $500 in the account. So you deplete that very quickly. Am I right?
Yes, that's correct.
What would be your alternative then?
I guess I could pull my 401k, or I could cash in some stocks.
Whatever it is, right? But again, you're at a point of leverage. So you have to understand the importance of that, because you're going to use that information when you prepare and frame your pitch. So make sure you collect that information. Now, another thing you also want to consider is the age of your client. And the reason why you want to have an idea of their age, because a point of leverage is, when do you plan to retire? Let's say, for example, you're talking to a client who's 50 years old, and they just literally opened up a 30-year fix 2 years ago. So they got 28 years left. That means if they go at the pace that they're at, they're going to have a mortgage payment until 78 years old, meaning they're going to work well beyond the ideal retirement age of 65. And, you could bring up certain things like, it's unfortunate that, the economy is where it's at. Just the other day, I was at Costco and I saw someone who should have been retired, but they have to stand at the exit of Costco to highlight my ticket. And it was disheartening to see that someone who should be retired, enjoying their retirement because they've worked most of their lives, is forced to bag groceries just to earn additional income. You're dropping that seed through storytelling. And why that's important is because they're living through that story. And so you have to understand that, because if in the event they tell you they don't want to go back to a 30-year, or they don't want to increase their debt or their loan amount, you have to look at their age. And if they're at 60 years old and they have a 30-year fix, and say, well, if your intent is to really have this house paid off by the time you're 90, right, then more power to you. But again, when you have that information, you're able to voice it and they can hear it and digest it in a completely different way. Oftentimes it's something they never really thought about. They just thought about, can I afford this monthly payment? That's a really helpful piece of information that you keep in your back pocket, so that you can address the objections before they come up. Because if you understand this, and you understand that there are only so many different objections, you can learn how to address them before they even come up. That's some ninja type status right there. That's like Jedi mind trick. And so you have to get in the habit of understanding the importance of that. On the flip side, if you notice that they're like 7 years old and they're on a 30-year fix, you can ask them, like, what's the long-term goal of the home? Like, are you going to sell it in 5 years? Maybe move into, like a retirement community? Or do you intend to maybe pass the property down to your kids or your grandkids? And they'll answer you, right? Like,
yeah, maybe I'll pass it down to my children.
Now, the problem with that is, though, is that if you think about it, when they pass down a property, a mortgage to their kids, oftentimes they're forced to sell it because their kids now have their own kids. They have their own responsibilities, which does not enable them to take on more accountability, more debt. And so it becomes a burden. Does that make sense? So if they have the ability to pay off their debt or pay it down faster at a shorter term, they're not handing their kids debt. They're not passing on a burden. Instead, they're passing on an asset. And that asset can build generational wealth. And therefore, they're taking care of not only their kids, but their grandkids. Now, that's an emotional tie because we naturally, as parents, we want to protect our children, especially our grandchildren, right? And so that can really kind of, motivate the thought. It can really put in place like the whole perspective of, are you sure your plans are in line with what's realistic, right? Because investment properties or taking over properties and then having to deal with settling and arbitration, that just becomes a burden on whoever has to take over the property. So it's best that they resolve all their debt issues, they pay off all their debt and put it into a mortgage where if they're accustomed and they're okay with spending what they spend, go ahead and apply it to the mortgage. You're just going to pay it off that much sooner, thus leaving less of a liability to those you pass the property on to. That's facts. Now, the last piece of leverage that I'm going to share with you is when you do your actual credit scrub. And so when you scrub your credit report, it's important for you to consider a few things. So number one is you have to go through every single account. And so everything from the mortgage to like the car loans to the credit cards. But here's where you actually build leverage, right? So let's just say I was going through your credit report. I would ask and say, hey, it looks like your mortgage is with ABC lender and your balance is this and your payment is this, right? Have you noticed, John, that payment has changed or has it always stayed the same since you opened the loan? And oftentimes, because of the current tax situation, their taxes may have went up. So it could have very well increased, but you wouldn't know that unless you ask, right? Same thing with car loans. So if you see a car loan, it's very important that you identify like, hey, I see a car loan with Chase. Is this your car or did you co-sign for someone? Because if they co-sign for someone, it may not necessarily be of importance or relevant to their budget, but if it's theirs, then you have something to kind of lean on because usually car payments have, a higher payment. And so if we can actually take that unhealthy debt that's tied to a depreciating asset, if you will, right? It's depreciating in terms of the value of the vehicle is dropping tremendously, very quickly, while the actual owner of the vehicle is still making payments and, then they take the negative equity and bring it onto their next car that they finance, if applicable. But you also do it with credit card debt. And so if you look at the credit card debt, and you notice that, you got a Barclays credit card, balance is at, 2,977, but you also see that the max credit limit is 3,000. So that's an opportunity to gain leverage. You could say, you know what, I noticed that you're pretty much maxed out on this account. Has the balance always been this high? Did something happen to where you had to finance something? And then they could very well mention that,
yeah, it's always been about that high, or yeah, I pay it down, but then I rack it back up, or yeah, I had to get a water heater, and so, I put it all on that credit card.
And then you ask them and say, okay, and then how much is it you pay, right? Never mention the payment you see on the credit report. Actually ask them, how much is it you pay per month? And then if they tell you an amount that's close to the minimum, reaffirm that. Say, okay, so basically you're just paying the minimum.
Yeah, that's correct. I pay a little bit above the minimum.
Oh, I see. Is there any reason why you're not paying more than that? And then again, they'll open up and say,
yeah, I'd love to. With the cost of living, I could barely make ends meet. It's so difficult to juggle everything because the cost of living is increased.
Now you got more power, more tools to actually use in your favor when you do your presentation or when you actually do your pitch. And it means that much more, right? But here's a side tip. Here's a hidden value, right? When you go through the accounts, actually make note. So if they tell you like, yeah, I had to buy a water heater, I didn't have enough money in the bank, I can't pay above the minimum, right? That's an opportunity for you to collaborate with them and work with them versus against them. Because you don't want to sound too like inquisitive to where you're breaking them down, you make them feel like they're worthless or they're a bum. So you want to be like, oh, okay, I understand. Let me make note of that real quick. And then you whisper it back as if you're typing it. Had to finance water heater, did not have the money available in the bank, right? Trying to pay off, but can barely make ends meet, so is forced to pay the minimum, right? Okay, so, and then you move on to the next. What's happening there psychologically is that you're jotting down information that's facts, but they're hearing it again. Because, when you say something, but you hear it back, it's a completely different thing. Not only that, but when they hear you say it, they are assured that you listen to them. And then they also feel like, okay, that's right. That sounds good. Thank you so much for making note of that. Same thing with late payments, right? So for those of you who don't know, anytime you have a derogatory report, it stays on your credit for like 7 up to 10 years. And so if they had a late payment on the credit card or a car or even the mortgage, like back in 2018, 2019, whatever year it was, really leverage that. Say, hey, I noticed that there was a late payment on this Barclays credit card back in 2018. It's actually February, March, and April 2018. What happened? Was it a misunderstanding, a mistake, or did you go through financial hardship?
Oh yeah, I went through financial hardship, lost my job, and I couldn't make the payments on that, blah, blah, blah.
Whatever the reason is. Actually tell them, say, okay, let me see if I can help you justify these lates, and maybe, if anything, see if I can get you some information on how to remove these lates. Let me just add a couple notes. Went through financial hardship, lost job, took a while, couldn't make the payment on the credit cards, but now he's working, now they're stable, and has not made any payments. Can we remove? Right? So you're whispering it, acting as if you're inputting the information, and you really are, because you're actually typing notes, but they just feel like you're feeding that information to, a third party. And if we can leverage, again, that third party, we speak through the third party. So instead of saying, I want you to be financial free, I want you to have this much savings, you can divert it and communicate through like a third party. And so, Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac or VA, FHA loan, whatever type of loan type they have, you could say VA is, they want you to have the security to make sure that you're able to make the payments. They want you to have the cash flow so that you're never in a position where you have to max out your credit cards and it weigh on your FICO. They never want you to be in a position where, if in the event something changed with your employment again, you have the assets and liquidity to make sure that your bills are covered for a period of time. Whether it's 6 months or 12 months, you at least have a safety net to fall back on if in the event history repeats itself. Now that's powerful, because now you're talking through a different entity, but you're also conveying a message that they relate with, and it's not a biased opinion. It's not you trying to sell me, it's facts, right? So FHA definitely doesn't want you to default. That's why they insure it. VA, same thing, they guarantee the loan. So of course they don't want them to default, but more importantly, they have exclusive access to different programs. And so when you're selling them this cash out service, in their back pocket, they'll always have a streamlined program. So like VAs have EARLs, FHAs has streamlines, right? That helps you help them digest and accept the rate change and that gap, because they'll always have 6 months later, as long as they behave themselves and the market allows, they can always lower the rate and payment. That's the only thing a streamline can do. It has to lower your rate and payment, right? So, and you're speaking facts. But again, these are a few things that I'm noticing that most loan officers are not doing, and I hope you start implementing it now. All right, guys, so that's the end of the video. If you found any value, please do me a favor in return. Simply like, comment your feedback below in the comment box, and share it with somebody. Share it with somebody you work with. Share it with somebody you know in the industry. Share it with somebody who is having some problems right now in keeping their production up, right? Whether it's your team, yourself, your team members, or your sales manager, and put it out there, because there are a lot of people who need help with this information, but they just simply don't have it. Now you have it. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in the next video.